Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Todd Acamesis. I'm going to do my very best to condense my talk to an hour. This is the kind of talk I would usually do over the course of maybe 3 hours, or maybe even over the course of 9 days at one of my long events. So I think when dealing with multidimensional reality, there is a lot to talk about. There's some grounding that we have to get. But I'm going to give you a lot of my personal experiences, which is, I think, one of the best ways to relate this information. So I'll give you a little bit of background on myself first, and then we'll take it forward from there, when I'll then launch into sort of my feelings about the evidence side that we could be living in that physical reality, the nature of physical reality could actually be illusional in the sense of a mental construct. And I think lucid dreams are an excellent set of evidence for that. So we're going to have a good chat about that. And I'm going to do my absolute best as well to leave time for a Q&A. I'm hoping if I do my job up here properly, you'll have a lot of questions. So hopefully leave at least 15 minutes for Q&A. So that gives me about 45 minutes to actually set the groundwork. All right, everybody ready? Okay. Okay, so one of my very earliest childhood experiences was at age 5. I've got 3 brothers. My father used to take us on a day out to the local landfill, which was always a lot of fun. And there was reasons why it was actually fun. So he would take us to this place where it used to be a fishery. So there was a lot of old fishery ponds that were now being filled with rubbish and then covered over. And there were a few of the ponds that were still, operational in the sense there was water and there were some, the odd fish, but it was no longer a fishery. Now at this, what was effectively a dump, just a landfill, they had zip wires, and it was kind of in a forested, a wooded environment. So there was a few zip wires which my brothers and I would play on. There were wild pigs that we'd chase, and the pigs would chase us. And there were lots and lots of trees, and I love climbing trees. Even as an adult, I love climbing trees. So there was a lot to do. So we actually did look forward to going to the local landfill with our father. He used to have a lot of rubbish to clear and then dump at this place. So every other weekend, it seemed to be our little ritual and our way to bond with our father. So on one occasion, when I was 5 years old, I was sort of walking around one of the little ponds that was still sort of in operation, and got a little bit too close, and these were quite deep, and I fell into the water and fell, literally sank straight away. And there was then this flash after a bit of time. It didn't seem like much time, actually, and there was a flash, and then suddenly I was completely somewhere else, and this was quite fascinating to me. I had no idea what it was. And what I'm relating is a near-death experience, basically. And I'm standing in this sort of city environment, I guess is the best way to describe it. And there was this god-awful, mighty, humongous tree that got my attention straight away. And I just sort of raced right up this tree. And it seemed to be a little bit of a disconnect between the fact that I was no longer in this rubbish sort of dump. And I'm in this tree, and suddenly all these people started coming around the tree, and they're looking quite angry that I've climbed this tree. And then suddenly, another branch up from me, there's a man sitting there. And it's like, "Hello, Todd." And I was like, "Hello?" And curly-haired man, kind of like myself. And he said, "You're not really supposed to be here." And I thought he meant in the tree. And he actually, I could feel he could pick that up in my mind, which was quite interesting in itself, because he knew what I was thinking was these people seemed quite angry. He goes, no, you're probably not meant to be in this tree either. This is quite sacred to them. But you're not meant to be here. You've fallen in some water, and we need to get you back. And I'm going to get you some help. And then suddenly, there's this bit of a blur, and I'm being pulled out of the water by one of my brothers, who was a couple years older than me. And it was an experience that just has stayed with me for my entire life, and it almost seems as if it happened yesterday. The curious thing was, a couple months after that, soon after my 6th birthday, I started having lucid dreams. Anybody here know what a lucid dream is? Okay, so about half of you. So for those of you who are not familiar with lucid dreams, it's when you become aware that you're dreaming while your body is still asleep. So instead of waking up from a dream and realizing you were dreaming, you're waking up within the dream. And this is very interesting on many levels, because there's different sort of levels of lucidity that you can have in a dream as you can just like in waking life. Sometimes, you might be in a lecture like this and suddenly get distracted with your phone or, go into a daydream type state. And you're not quite lucid to the talk anymore, to what's being said. You're somewhere else. So the same can happen within the dream state. You can get lucid, but very quickly you can become unconscious again. So when you become truly lucid in a dream, the interesting thing is the level of physicality that can become very apparent. It can become as physically real as waking life. If you've never had a dream to that level of quality and realism, then I'm going to give you some tools at the end of my talk to where you can explore lucid dreaming for yourself, because it's one thing hearing something like this. It's another thing entirely exploring it for yourself and finding out the truth versus what might be a belief, what might be somebody else's personal truth. So I started having lucid dreams at age 6. And what made it really interesting was the physicality side of it. I would literally become lucid within a dream while I was asleep. Something would just trigger me within the dream to make me think, wait a second, I'm not awake, I'm dreaming. And I would then become so conscious and aware within that dream state to where I could start making changes. I'd communicate and interact with the dream characters. Sometimes they were just very plasticky in nature, didn't seem to have much consciousness or awareness behind them. But there was the odd dream character that seemed to have a spark to it, which you could interact with in a very profound way. And so when I'd start having these dreams, I'd then wake back into my physical body when I'd wake back up. And one of the things that I would note in my mind was just how physically real it was, and it started to confuse me. Because sometimes I'd have what's called a false awakening. Anybody here know what a false awakening is? A lot less. A false awakening is when you wake up in your bed, you get up, maybe you're on your way to the toilet, and on your way to the toilet you realize, wait a second, I don't have a cat. Where did this cat come from? And then maybe you look around you and realize that the hallway is different from usual. And you're like, oh my God, I'm still dreaming. Has anybody ever had anything like that? A lot more hands have just gone up. This is called a false awakening. So they usually take place after a vivid dream. Those of us who are doing lucid dreaming for a hobby, it happens quite frequently. And so what can happen is within a false awakening, you actually think you're awake. And then after a certain amount of time, maybe you realize you're still dreaming, or you wake back up in your bed again, or you don't remember at all. You fall unconscious within the false awakening, and you wake back up later without any memory that it's happened. It's like we're living a double life. So the false awakening is what I really want to talk about today, and I'm going to come back to that. I want to just push this a bit forward. So a few months after I started having the lucid dreams, I started having a second type of experience, which was very different from the lucid dreaming, but it was also happening at nighttime during sleep. But there was a huge difference between these two experiences. And I'm now going to articulate this as an adult, but keep in mind, as a child's consciousness at that time, I didn't have the labels that I'm going to use now to articulate this. So during the lucid dream state, what would typically happen is I would become aware while I was dreaming, and I would realize I was dreaming and my body was still asleep. If I happened to be in an environment that was like my house, there was usually a lot of things that were very different. It was never an exact copy of my house. It was never an exact copy of my bedroom. And if I was in something that was a simulant of my bedroom, I would never see my physical body, ever. And things were very changeable. I could change things about the dream very easily because the dream was being driven by my subconscious mind. I didn't realize that then. All I knew is that I could make changes if I didn't like something about the dream. When this second type of experience started taking place, which I'm now going to, as an adult, label an out-of-body experience, it would take place by either I would be asleep and then there would be a powerful shock to my system that would wake me up. We now call this a vibrational state, or the in-between state, where you get a buildup of energy and then you have an experience. So I'd be fast asleep and then suddenly I'd get these powerful energy sensations that would wake me back to full consciousness. I would usually feel myself where I couldn't move my body. I now know that to be what's called waking sleep paralysis. If you ever had a waking sleep paralysis episode, it's quite terrifying, especially when you've never had one before. So I would wake up into sleep paralysis. All I knew then was I couldn't move my body. Oh no, I know what's gonna happen next. I started having these episodes where I would then float away from my body, and I would then be standing in the center of my bedroom in most cases, or floating above my body, looking down at my body. So there were distinct differences between the dream state and the out-of-body state. And again, I didn't have these labels as a child, so this is me articulating as an adult, but it's what was taking place. So I knew there was a difference. Now, my mother was very into this stuff at the time. She is still a very spiritual person. And she would journal for me. I'd wake up because the experiences were so powerful. What was taking place was so real to me. And in some cases, I would literally have one of these false awakenings where I'd have something like I'd take a shower, I'd eat breakfast, then I'd be outside playing until something weird happened and I realized I was still dreaming, and then I woke up back in my bed again. Sometimes the false awakenings could be 2, 3, 4, or 5 back to back before I finally woke back up to to physical reality. As an adult, when this happens, it really makes me challenge. It's still quite challenging. When you have 5 or 6 false awakenings in a row, sometimes it makes you think, where is my world gone? And you're almost willing to accept the first world that comes along that's solid enough and that, you stay with long enough as, I'll just settle for this. It can get that way. It can really screw around with your mind a little bit, but it goes with the territory of this deep level reality exploration, because I sometimes find when you're having these back-to-back false awakenings, what they would call in the film Inception, dreams within dreams, to me it's as if you're experiencing this cascade of worlds, these probable worlds that are being created from other decisions that you're making in your life. Worlds that can be, completely in their own right real, maybe static to some degree, but interestingly enough can also have offshoots of us, like parallel versions of us. And I'll get to that later when I talk more about the false awakenings. So I just want to sort of stay on a timeline. So I'm age 6, I started having these experiences take place. My mother would usually journal for me at breakfast table. I'd draw a lot of the stuff that was taking place. So from a very early age, I was starting to have really interesting experiences during the nighttime. And sometimes it would confuse me into this position where I wasn't quite sure I was awake sometimes. There was an episode when I was 7 years old that's sort of testament to this. I remember waking up one morning, having a few false awakenings, and then getting dressed for school, and on the way to school still being unsure of whether or not I was awake. But there was a lot of continuity, between what took place after that thought. So I eventually settled in to think, okay, this is real, this is the real world, this isn't a dream, this isn't whatever else those other things are. And I remember it came about halfway through the day at recess. The bell for recess rang. All the other kids got up to walk off to go outside to play. And I had this overwhelming energy come over me that literally kept me in my spot. It was like this profound state of gravity. And I literally put my head down on the table, and there was this spinning sensation, and then a flash of light, and then I was standing next to my physical body. And it was really quite challenging, again, to have an experience like this. Now I'm, again, as a 7-year-old, questioning what's going on. And then this man that I met 2 years earlier in the near-death experience, this curly-haired man appeared again. He was like, good to see you again, Todd. He goes, my name is Blue. And we had a very short conversation. And he said, I'm basically looking after you, and I'm going to look after you up until you're about in your 20s. And it was really weird to have a conversation like this with someone who was much older than me, who I had no idea who they were, but I was used to having these out-of-body experiences where I would meet people like him who would come to me on a regular basis, but this was only the second time that he'd made an appearance up until that time. But he basically was saying, I'm going to look after you. As an adult, I would now articulate that as a guide, as a guardian angel, whatever you want to call it. And he said, I'm going to look after you up until about a time when you move overseas and you get married and you're going to have your firstborn daughter. I was like, daughter? I was like 7 years old. I was like, And the experience ended and I was back in my body, and it took about a few minutes to really gain my balance again. But it was really, again, it's a powerful episode for a child to be experiencing, especially not to really have the quality of knowledge to go along with what was actually taking place. So now I'm going to fast forward to age 10. A lot of significant things took place between those 3 years, but one of the biggest things was age 10 when my biological father died. So I remember waking up one morning. My father was always out early before everybody else. He was a builder, very strong man, about my height, but bulkier. And I woke up one morning and I walked by his bedroom and I could see him sort of back, lying on the bed with his feet and legs hanging off the bed. And he was breathing in a very weird way, and I just knew. Now, if I sort of get a little bit, my voice breaks. It's still one of those things. It's very emotional. And I just knew in that moment that there was something, quite wrong. But my mother was, already on the case, it seemed, and she was like, "Look, your father's just not very well," and she sort of practically pushed us out the house to go to school. All day at school, I kind of buried my head in my arms on my desk because I knew I would never see my father again. It was a very strong intuitive feeling. Got home later that day, and the experience, confirmed my intuition. He was not there. He was in hospital. He was in hospital for about 2 weeks, and we weren't allowed to see him for whatever dumb reason. The politics at the time of hospitals and parents and such. My oldest brother, who was 14, did get to see him and say goodbye. He then died. And I was tore up for months. I remember about a week later when we had the funeral. It was an open casket funeral. We have those in the States allowing. And I remember going up to the casket, looking at him. He looked very peaceful, as an undertaker can make you look. And I was stroking his face. And it was I had one of these moments where I was wondering, because of all these other experiences I had, if he was there in the room with us at that moment. And I had a lot of clairvoyant experiences as a child, but in that moment, it didn't, I didn't have that experience. But I kind of felt that he was there. And this is the one thing I love about out-of-body experiences as an adult. I use out-of-body experiences as a self sort of realization tool. This ability to be able to move between different levels of reality, to gather information while other people sleep. I think sometimes people get the wrong idea. They think I just lie around on my sofa all day and do this stuff. I really don't. I have, this is the type of work I do. I give talks. I prepare for my talks. I own a mind spa here in London. You can get the details from Ladron over here. We have an amazing center where, there you go. We have these gongs that you see behind us. We have about another 7 of them back at the spa. It's an amazing place. You walk through, and the impression we want to give you when you walk through is that you're stepping into another dimension of reality. We have a huge 3-meter tall pyramid, which is grounded to the earth outdoors with a sheet metal base. We have a brand new chakra light that we've developed, and we have a powerful light machine called Pandora's Star. I've got it in my bag over here. I just haven't taken it out, but again, you can take some details from Ladron over there, and he'll steer you in the right direction. So I do a lot of work during the daytime. I don't just lounge around on my sofa and go to other dimensions of reality. I reserve this for when I sleep at night, because I feel when I'm awake here in physical reality, I want to be present with people. I want to be present with my life as much as possible. Now, that's not always the case. I think, the statistic says 96% of our day is governed by unconscious thought and feelings. So for me, it's like any other thing within a spiritual practice. It's a step-by-step process, learning to become more and more conscious on this level of reality. Because one of the things that's important to me is, if I'm going to go to other worlds, other dimensions of reality, and I want to be present there, shouldn't I be present here? Shouldn't this be my first role? Because this is our primary waking reality. This is our grounded reality in a sense, because it is our primary waking reality. So we'd want to be as present in our lives here to get more from it. Because when I teach people the out-of-body experience or the lucid dream stuff, and they combine the practices, and sometimes they get confused and like, I don't know what is the lucid dream or out-of-body experience. They can seem so similar. And I say, ultimately, at this stage, it doesn't matter what state of mind it is. What matters is your level of conscious awareness within the experience. Same as within the experience of life. Because the more conscious we are, the more we get to see beyond the surface layers where we get stuck. Where we get stuck with the fear mind. And the fear mind is always present. So it's learning to be able to navigate that by staying more present within yourself. So sticking with the timeline, so I'm at my father's funeral. And I did feel, that he was probably there. I just couldn't see him. I didn't have the clairvoyance. So again, that's a label I use as an adult. I didn't have that label as a child, but I knew now and again I could be standing with friends at school, and suddenly maybe another child appears, and nobody could see him. And I learned very quickly not to talk about children that other children couldn't see, because it started getting this weird sort of energy where other children would sort of label me, all the different names they can label us, including E.T. I'm 47 years old this month, and when I was, I think, whatever age it was, and back in the 1970s when E.T. came out, or no, it was the 1980s, I was young enough at the time to see it when it first came out, and I got labeled E.T. I think it was age 12 because of some of this weird stuff. So I was at his funeral, and I had all these thoughts. I missed him quite a bit, and for the next 2 months, I cried and I cried and I cried. My grieving period was quite long. And it came to a point where I think it was really playing a lot on my mother because, this was her soulmate. And I think it really cut her up to see me really cut up so bad. And she was always trying to be really strong, and I could sense that. So she came to me, and she was, I think out of desperation, she was like, Todd, you've got to stop. You've got to stop crying. And I knew she didn't really mean that, but I think it really hurt her, that every day it affected me so much. So I remember that very night that she said that, I went to sleep with this, feeling. And I woke up sometime in the early hours with someone standing at the end of my bed. I could just sort of make out the shadow. And I woke and I had that sleeping paralysis, which, I'd come to realize was not something scary by that time. It took me a few years to get over it. And I suddenly had this voice in my head. It was a very reassuring voice, and then I recognized that was my father's voice. And he said, Todd, I'm okay. I'm on one of these other levels that you sometimes visit. And that was really quite shocking. He was now reporting to me something that, he didn't, I think, take too seriously when I was, when he was alive. He'd seen my mother journaling this stuff. She'd obviously talked about some of it with him. But now he's experiencing this firsthand for himself again, because he's deceased from this level, but obviously not, the longer journey. We have this essence within us which, survives death and precedes birth. We all call it the soul, whatever, your personal labels are for these things. And so now, fast forward a few more years, a couple other really interesting experiences took place, but it was age 12 when this stuff started to really sort of disappear off my radar. I no longer was having lucid dreams. I was no longer having these out-of-body experiences. And it was like a part of my life, there was like a door was being closed. But it was a door that I was uncomfortable with being closed because I'd met so many amazing, what I would say, non-physical beings in these states. And the lucid dream state I found could really help me gain a lot of confidence in my waking life. I remember age 10, started age 9 actually, my mom and dad decided to move house. And when we moved house, it meant moving schools. And where previously I was integrated enough, now going into another school with, not being a really grounded child like everyone else seemed to be, I got a lot of mental bullying that took place. And I remember the first year at this new school was not so nice. Year 2 at this new school, I remember walking to school, wasn't feeling very well, sat down at the desk, chose a desk, sat down, and then the teacher invited everybody, all the kids to stand up, walk around and introduce themselves to each other. And when I looked up, I saw this blonde girl walking towards me, and I was like, really felt a connection with her. And I got excited, and then I puked all over my desk. This was blah, and then she was like, whoa. And I didn't get introduced to her properly on that day. The teacher sent me home, and things kind of went downhill from there. We'd go out to recess, and it was usually, we had one class that we'd stick with the whole day, and the teacher, would sort of teach different subjects. We went out to recess, and the same teacher would also teach physical ed. And one of the popular sports was American football. I always got picked last. Even the girls got picked before me. Maybe I just wasn't there enough in physical reality for people's liking. So I remember in one lucid dream episode, I had my curly-haired friend come back to me, and he said, let me help you with this. He says, I understand you're having difficulty at school with this particular thing. And he started showing me how to play football, and it was as physically real as it was in waking life. And over the course of that year, I got progressively better at football in real life, to the point to where I was one of the first ones picked by the end of the year. So lucid dreams themselves can be, very interesting for everyday life. The things that we learn within a lucid dream, we can apply in our physical life. I've got a friend who is a dancer, and she's a very good lucid dreamer, and she practices lucid dreaming practices dancing while she's sleeping. There was one dance move that she really couldn't nail for months. She nailed it in a dream, and on that very day she nailed it in a dream, she nailed it in physical reality. There's actually a few hospitals in Italy which are using lucid dreaming to help patients heal faster. It's a really interesting concept for healing, and I'll hopefully get a chance to talk about that. Like I said, I've only got an hour. I'm trying to crunch as much into this period as I can. So age 12, things really started to shut down. I did start integrating a little bit more with other kids, to the point to where I joined Boy Scouts age 13, and for a year made some really good friends. Age 14, I remember this one night very clearly. We'd always have our scout meetings at this local church, and me and the other boys decided week in and week out that we'd always arrive 30 minutes early so we can play hide and seek before the scoutmaster would arrive. So this time of year it was quite dark because of the seasonal change, and I remember hiding behind a tree and seeing my clear line of sight to the steps of this church, which were concrete steps, and that was home base. Okay, so that was homey. And I saw one of the seekers go off in the other direction, so I just made a beeline for those steps. And I leapt up to land on the steps, but I misjudged the step. And I sort of tripped so fast and so quickly that my hands just, brain-body communication, there wasn't any. And they just didn't react, and I just went splat right on the concrete, and my head bounced several times as it sort of slowed me down. And I laid there in absolute shock. Everybody else was still out and about, and I sat up, and my vision was just radically different. I actually started seeing, it was what I would describe now as multiple realities, like maybe what a schizophrenic experiences, because to me, schizophrenia is probably a misdiagnosed clairvoyant. And I could suddenly start seeing these different levels, like one scenery and then another scenery and then the scenery of the churchyard, and they were all overlaying each other, but I was getting this sort of tunnel vision that was taking place. And there were these people that were there, standing around me, watching me, looking very concerned, who I knew were not physical, were not part of my physical world. I then sort of got myself up. I walked into the meeting place, and I sat down and waited for everybody else to come in. And the whole time, I didn't tell anybody that I fell over. And I just sort of sat there with all this weird imagery, these multiple layers of imagery taking place. And my mother eventually picked me up after the end of the meeting. I didn't tell her what took place. I remember going to bed that night. My head was throbbing. I still had, all this sort of different layers of imagery taking place, and I really could feel my energy. I was really weak. I fell asleep, and I woke up later that night with me standing in the middle of my room, looking at my physical body, and looking at another, what seemed like a second body, what I would now know as my energy body, the human energy field. And there were other beings standing around this energy form and my physical body. And my curly-haired friend was standing here. And I was like, hello again, Todd. Hello. And he was explaining to me, the fall that you took was actually, quite dangerous. And I should have, got help from somebody. And that now they were doing what they could on my human energy field to help the physical body. And he was trying to explain as best as he can, because I was 14 and this was all, what was taking place was something that had never taken place before. And I was in shock to what was taking place to a degree. And I think what really saved me on that moment was the previous experiences I had that really grounded me more into that moment. And as he was explaining the repair work, in a sense, that they were doing to my human energy field, he said, well, no, he finished with that, and my thoughts were going like at 1,000 miles an hour, because I suddenly had this strange thought about school. I usually have to sit in the front row at school because my eyesight, was always very poor. And so in order to see the chalkboard, I'd have to sit quite close. And I suddenly started wondering, well, if they can fix, this accident, I wonder if they can fix my vision. And I didn't say that out loud. And then suddenly this curly-haired man, he was like, we can fix, what's taken place because it was an accident. We can't fix your vision. He didn't use the word karma, but he was, again, that's a label I'm using now, so I'm going to say it. He said, your vision is a karmic thing. That's something that has to, get healed, through a process that you do. And again, he didn't use the word karma, but that's how I'm relating it as an adult. It was a very deep experience, very moving experience for me. I remember waking the next morning, still throbbing, but I was there in physical reality. And I was told by this curly-haired man that, once again, I'm kind of crossing over a little bit too early, and I have things to do still. So I now fast forward another few years. Age 17, my mother remarried a couple of years before that. I wasn't getting on very well with my stepfather. And I left home, I left high school, didn't get my diploma, and I decided I just need to get out of here. So I told my mother I was going hitchhiking. She was not, those were not words she wanted to hear. She was kind of very terrified for me, and I was a bit terrified myself, but I was just trying not to worry her even more. And so I packed a few bags. She dropped me off somewhere, and it was so hard for her, but she knew I wouldn't stay. So I went on the road and I started hitchhiking. And this became my life on and off for about 3 years. And I had a lot of really amazing experiences with synchronicity, which I'd like to hopefully have a little bit of time to talk about as well. I'm just going to check the time. So I hitchhiked for quite a few years, up until about the age of 23, when I decided I wanted to go overseas. But this was a last-minute decision, because when I was hitchhiking, for one of the very last moments, I got picked up by a traveling circus, basically, and it had always been my sort of ambition as a child to, join the circus. And so I was hitchhiking in New Mexico, and these circus trucks went by, and they were sort of on the road to the next town, and the last one picked me up. Long story short, I worked with them for a couple of weeks, made some decent money, and the guy let me live in the back of the truck. So, I got to save money. So by the end of a couple weeks, I had a couple $1,000s, because what he promised me was that if I worked on one of these little gaming stalls for kids with him, I could have 25% of all the takings. And I'd learned within 2 weeks how to really sort of work a crowd, and on some nights I was making this guy a couple $1,000s, and so therefore making 25% of that myself. So I now had all this money. I was sleeping in the back of the truck, so in my mind I was getting rich in the back of a truck. And I had everything I needed, because I was used to being on the road, and I was used to life not being so easy. And then I suddenly had this really powerful moment where, again, I felt like this gravity come over me. And I had this feeling that I needed to leave tomorrow. And it was so strong. I questioned it. I was like, I took out my wad of money, and I was like, no, I'm not leaving. But the feeling was so strong. So I got out my deck of cards, which I always kept with me. And I used to use these deck of cards, in a way to sort of follow my inner guidance. So if I was unsure about something, I'd do something like, okay, 52 cards. If I pull a number something, that's my sign. So I'm shuffling the deck, and I'm thinking, okay, the number 9. If I pull a number 9, I'll leave tomorrow. There's only 4 of those, so there's a great chance I'm going nowhere. Turned over a bloody 9. I was like, yeah! But I really stuck with it, and I usually did. When I had a sign like that appeared, I would always follow it. I didn't need 2 signs. I only needed 1. So the next morning I said goodbye, and I got on the road, and within a short few weeks, I'd got a passport sorted out with that money. I'd paid my stepfather back some cash that I owed him, and I went along a hitchhiking route where I could say goodbye to all 3 of my brothers, not knowing whether or not I'd ever come back to the States again. On the flight over, I met who would eventually be my wife. I'm now divorced from her, but we were together for 17 years, and we've got 3 children together. They all live here in London as well. So what was interesting, after we were married for about 3 months, the marital house that we moved into had a lot of things going bump in the night. And it got to the point to where we were both quite alarmed by some of the things that were taking place, like poltergeist type stuff. And what I didn't know was that my wife at the time was talking to her mother about this, and her mother was kind of into spirituality in a weird way. And she had invited some mediums over, but nobody told us this. And so one night there's this knock on the door in the evening time, and I open the door and there's these three sort of ladies just standing there looking quite ominous, and we're here to sort out your ghosts and stuff. And I was like, what? And she said, yes, your mother-in-law or whoever asked us to come by. And I was like, okay, fine, come on in. And they came in and they found energies all over the place that needed to be moved on. And it was a really fascinating process. And then I have to stop right there really quickly and then step back to my hitchhiking days. When I hitchhiked, because of the curly-haired man that would appear to me every now and again, I only got, he only ever gave me one name, and it was Blue. And when I hitchhiked, I had an alter ego, and it was Blue Skies. That was my nickname. So now going back to that moment. So they're going around this house, and they're clearing all this energy, and it actually, you could tangibly feel the shift that was taking place. There was definitely something energetically that was changing. One of the three women then pulled me aside, and the other two went through with my wife, who was only a couple months pregnant at the time. And she stood there and she said, your wife's pregnant, isn't she? And I was like, yeah, that was quite interesting. She had stuff on where you couldn't really tell. And she goes, there's something else here. There's a message that I'm being told to give you. That's blue skies. And I was like, that was my hitchhiking name. But it was also this curly guy, his first name. And she goes, Blue Skies, there's a guide here called Blue Skies. And he's telling me that he's going to be moving on soon and that you're going to have a new guide. But not to worry, because this next guide will stay with you for quite a lot of, the next stage of life. And it was just such a moving moment. And I was always, up until that time, really deeply fascinated by how this information could transfer between these different layers. And it got to a point when I was an adult that I started to explore the paranormal through remote viewing, through reading a lot. I was reading a lot of UFO magazines. I got really into that kind of thing. I got heavily into the conspiracy stuff to the point to where I'd go and do the school run. I'd have this little foot-powered scooter. I'd stop by Tesco's. I'd fill it up with maybe a couple hundred pounds worth of non-perishables or long shelf life stuff like sardines and cans that would last 10 years. And I'd come home and I had this ritual, and I'd pull up the floorboards of the house basically, and I'd start burying all this food under the house. By the end of the year, I'd probably amassed at least 2 years of supplies of food, water, knives, fake guns, gold, silver coins, medical supplies, books, you name it, I had it. I was a real conspiracy nut, and I was convinced we were going to have one of these Mad Max scenarios, all of society was going to fall apart. George Bush was president at the time. It wasn't pretty. And my wife always saw this stuff going on, and I think she thought I was just a little bit, crazy. I was really locked into my fear mind back at that time. And again, I didn't realize what that was. I didn't realize that it was a part of us which is sort of cut itself off from this bigger reality, this reality of love, where we have this infinite support, which is always there. So I started delving into the UFO sort of stuff, and a couple years later, after really getting into all of this, I found out about something called remote viewing. And it's where basically the US military used to train psychics to become even more psychic, to then use their abilities to spy on their other countries like the Soviet Union at the time, or the Russia as it became. And I thought it was a fascinating tool that I wanted to learn so I could then check into the UFO phenomena, because it didn't seem to be getting much from magazines, UFO magazines, and other things like 14 Times. So I learned this technique from someone who was quite in the know. I got pretty decent at it. I started having some interesting results. But back in 2005, when I was 35 years old, I came across a website which was talking about this product called hemi-sync. And in particular, from one particular organization called the Monroe Institute, who had their own hemi-sync product, which was called the Gateway Experience. And so I thought, I'll do research on this. And the research I did, a lot of people were talking about having out-of-body experiences and having the remote viewing stuff go to the next level. So I got really excited. I ordered the product. It was 18 CDs when it got delivered to me about a week later. And I was reading through the literature, and it said, okay, take your time with this. Take about 3 months to explore it. Use it in sequential order from CD 1 to CD 18. And I'm really impetuous. I'm really, not the type to have patience. So I looked over the syllabus, and I saw the 3 CDs that I wanted for the out-of-body process was CDs 16, 17, and 18. I was like, fuck! I've got to go through all that other stuff. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to just, full-time, I'm going to blow through this whole program in a week. Forget 3 months. 1 week, I'll be done with this, and I'll get out-of-body. And because I had this feeling that the out-of-body stuff would be important to me, and it started to click that that's probably what was happening to me as a child. And I wanted to re-explore that stuff. So first night, I used the product, put the headphones on, and woke up about 5 o'clock in the morning, freezing cold on the sofa. I'd fallen unconscious, and I don't remember anything from the track. It went on like that for about a week before I finally realized I needed to slow down. I needed to have more patience. I needed to have more respect for this very powerful hemi-sync technology. I then decided I will slow down. I will take it to the point of maybe 3 months to explore it. 3 months went by, and I became a better meditator. I was able to sit still for an hour, keep focused on one idea without my mind drifting very much. So I got that. I didn't have any out-of-body experiences. Another sort of 9 months went by. I became an even better meditator. I could sit for hours and meditate and not get very distracted. And I was starting to become more calm. I started to realize things like Bush being president wasn't that important to me anymore. The Queen, even if she is a reptile, it didn't matter to me much anymore. Things really started to shift inside me. It just felt like I was shifting more away from, that parallel world of fear and more into, who we truly are. And then it finally happened. A year into this practice, I was lying on my sofa after a series of events. Late at night, I woke up. I was lying on my sofa, had an eye mask on, and suddenly had these very powerful vibrations. And I could feel I was in waking sleep paralysis, so I couldn't move my body. And suddenly I could see through the eye mask, so I knew something interesting was taking place. And within a few more seconds using a technique, I was now standing next to my body, which was now lying on the sofa. And as I then sort of went to walk away further, this light started very quickly pouring into the room, but it was non-physical in nature. And this hand just appeared out of nowhere, and it was there, and I was like, holy shit, it freaked me out. I mean, just this hand just appears, and it was cut off here. It was just a disembodied hand. I was like, shit, nobody told me about disembodied hands, in all the books I was reading. And it freaked me out. I was back in my body again, and I couldn't see the eye mask. Through the eye mask, I could feel I was in the paralysis. So I was then like, damn it. I was really upset at myself. A whole year I've practiced to get to that moment. And somebody sticks out their hand, and I freak out and practically piss my pants, and I'm back in my body. But I thought, you know what? I can do this. I can feel the paralysis. I can achieve this. I can get back out. And for another couple of minutes, I was sort of trying to get those vibrations back, and eventually they came back, and they were stronger. Again, I could see through the eye mask. I made a command to sit out of my body. I was out of my body, and there was no hand. I could see my physical body. I thought, okay, there's no hand. Maybe that was just my imagination. And then this hand came back again, and I was like, oh, Jesus. And I thought, you know what? I've practiced hard, and I'm not going to let a hand stop me. So I thought, what lies on the other side of that hand is probably magic. And so I thought, I'm going to embrace this as like a fear test. And so I put out my hand, and I was amazed. I was like, my God, it was like a duplicate of my physical body. And so I put up my hand, and this other hand just took hold of me and maneuvered me slowly away further from my body. And it didn't let go, and it sort of withdrew into the light, and the light disappeared, and I was left there on my own. It didn't last very long. It was only a few minutes, but it was such a profound experience that when I did wake back into my body, I was convinced I could do this again the next night. And so I woke up purposely after a short sleep in the early hours of the morning to practice a technique that I'd learned in a book about a week before, a sleep interruption technique. And within a week, I was able to have 2 more out-of-body experiences. Within another week, it was up to 7. So within a space of having none to 2 weeks later, having my first one, I'd had like 7 or 8 experiences. And I had this little routine that I quickly developed. I would get out of body, I would then look at my physical body to make sure it was safe. I would walk through a wall or a window, and I would be out in my garden, and then I'd maybe try to go to the moon or visit somebody. And this went on for about 30 out-of-body experiences until one morning I got up, and I could feel the energy was different from previous days. And I laid down, and about an hour later of doing this practice, I could suddenly see through my eye mask, and I made the command to come out of body, and I was standing there, and again, I did the practice of double-checking my body was safe. I looked around, I did a double-take, and it was, fuck! My body was missing. My physical body was gone. I'd only been out of body for like a second. I was like, fuck! And I was panicked, but this voice sort of washed through me. It was like, your body's fine. It's exactly where you left it. You're no longer near the physical plane. And it was like, hello? And you're no longer near the physical plane. You're a couple dimensions deep. And I was like, deep dimensions? What? And I said, well, how come I can still see my house? And he was like, it's a thought form. It's what you expected to have appear to you. And I was like, well, what do I do? He goes, well, I'm standing right next to you practically. You're literally within, your awareness is within this energy bubble of this thought form. He said, if you just let go that the idea that this exists, that it's just an illusion, you'll see me. And within just a couple of seconds of letting go of that idea and having this, sort of almost like one of the film Limitless, one of those moments where you just know what to do. And I just thought, anything that's not real, disappear. And it started to disappear, and there was this man standing there. And he took me on this sort of tour of what I would now label the astral planes and explained some stuff to me, and it was really quite fascinating. So as an adult, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit forward. So he started to explain the nature of reality to me, and I found it really quite interesting. So this is now getting into the bit to where I'm going to put a question to you, or an idea to you, the idea that perhaps physical reality, like the Buddhists talk about, like a lot of other old ancient traditions talk about, that physical reality to a degree is an illusion. It's very real to us, obviously. We have physical bodies. We're very much locked into the state of consciousness. It is very real. But there's an aspect to where, how real is it? What do we mean by real? What can we label real? And it was the physicality that always stuck with me. And so this man was explaining to me that reality on a grander scale was just like infinite frequencies. So there was like this frequency domain. And that when souls became powerful enough, they could become what's called a creator soul. And they could literally create reality. They could create virtual realities. He didn't use the term virtual reality. That's my term. Well, it's not mine. I borrowed that too. But, and he was basically saying that through this process of becoming very developed, very mature, very evolved, you could actually start to create realities within realities. And the idea of the turtles all the way down started coming into my mind when I was having this information related to me, and he was like, yes, that's exactly it. And he said, so basically your earth plane is a time domain and that overlays the same space domain as we're in right now, but it's a different time domain. And he started giving me sort of this metaphor, which was sort of like, your telecoms companies back on your world, your radio stations, your TV stations. They all have different frequencies. They're unique in that frequency domain. And you don't get a clash within the space and the time domain because they've all agreed to be on different signals, different frequencies. And he said that's exactly what the multiverse is. It's that exact same thing. We have these infinite frequencies in this bigger domain. We created this space domain, and we have all these multitudes of time domains. And it was a very fascinating sort of lesson that he was giving me. And by the time I came back to my body and I started writing all this down, I thought, just keep writing. I'll have a book before the morning comes. Because it was so much information. The volume of information was quite staggering. So I then started having regular out-of-body experiences, regular lucid dream experiences. And I now want to relate some of the lucid dreams in particular, because this is the evidence that I'm going to put forward that reality could be a mental construct. So this is the first I'd like to read to you. This was a false awakening that took place back in August of 2005. I woke from a lucid dream on the sofa in my lounge, where I fell asleep the night before, and noticed a ceiling fan spinning around and around. And then I remembered, we don't have a ceiling fan, and I thought, this is a false awakening. Now lucid in a second dream, I stood up and walked towards the bay window with the intent to walk straight through it, just like in my out-of-body experiences. So because the fidelity of that dream environment was as real as my physical environment, to the point even every artifact in the house looked exactly the same, to that level of realism and recreation. So I walked towards the bay window of the house with the intent to walk straight through it, but instead I wound up face planting a very real pane of glass. The shock of smashing into the glass face first woke me up from the dream as I found myself lying on the sofa for a second time. Damn false awakening, I kind of muttered to myself. I rubbed my nose. It was so real, I could still feel the numbness of running into the pane of glass within a dream. I then thought maybe I should perform a reality check before getting off the sofa this time to save myself from face planting any more hard surfaces. So I held out my left hand and I shook it for a few seconds, then looked at it for any anomalies and repeated this. So in lucid dreaming practice, we have something called reality testing and reality checks. So for me, one of my favorite at the time was to sort of shake my hand and then look at it, 4 fingers, 1 thumb, shake it, 4 fingers, 2 thumbs. Ooh, I must be dreaming. Because what's happening here, every time I take away my hand, shaking it and put it back in my field of vision, my subconscious is rendering. Because the soul, also the lesson I had from that one guy in that out-of-body experience where I was nowhere near the physical level, he was telling me how not every soul at this moment is able to create the level of entire worlds like I'm embedded in my physical world, or the astral planes where he was giving me a tour. But he said what every soul does have is they have a signal generator and a receiver. The receiver to receive signals from these other worlds to where they can connect to and experience. But also every soul has an inbuilt signal generator. So we can literally create worlds on the fly. Usually it's a very subconscious process. 10? Okay. All right, I'm being instructed. I haven't got much more time. So I'm going to move on. So I was back in my very real lounge. As I laid on the sofa thinking about the false awakening and the realism of the experience, I asked myself, can you really make the distinction between real and virtual, or is all reality just one big mental construct? And I remember, again, face planting that glass. It was very real to me. And when I woke back into my body, there was just like this shift where the dream world faded and physical reality appeared. Without a break in my conscious awareness, I went from one high-fidelity environment, which was just as physically real as the one I was now back in, without a break of consciousness. All that happened was mentally, I was shifting between realities. But both those realities were equal in density. It was quite alarming, to be honest. So just going on to another experience. So this is an experience that took place back in April of 2007. I woke up from a dream with some lingering imagery. Although I had a strong awareness of my physical body, I kept my eyes closed in the hope of using the imagery to transition into a lucid dream state. After doing some deep abdominal breathing, the imagery became very vivid as I found myself standing in a steam-filled room. So really absorb this. I woke from a dream where there was still some imagery left over. I had my eyes closed. I was lying in my bed with covers over me. I could feel my body. I could feel the bed underneath me. I could feel my breathing. I was using my breathing to try and generate new imagery. And then suddenly the imagery became very coherent, and it overlaid physical reality to the point to where I was now fully immersed in another environment. I was standing up in what seemed a dream body. I could feel mist, steam on my face, and the room was filled with steam, and it was white tiled, and I could feel the coldness with my feet, bare feet, standing on this cold tiled floor. I literally just left my bedroom, which was real, into another environment which was now equally real to the point I could feel the mist on my face. I then heard this woman scream, very loud scream, and I was like, oh, fuck. And I turned around and slap. This woman was naked, and I obviously was in her bathroom. I don't know if it was a dream bathroom or a real bathroom on another dimensional world somewhere else, but I got slapped hard. Slapped so hard, it woke me back into my physical body. Literally the shock of it was a little bit of a blur, and then I was under my covers again. And I'm lying there, and I'm just sort of now lift up my hand, and I'm like, Jesus, that hurt. I could still feel it in physical reality. A few hours later, when I woke up and I looked in the mirror, I had a bruise right here where she slapped me. Now, a lot of psychologists could say, this is an artifact of, consciousness, blah, blah, blah. Lucid dreamers, out-of-body explorers, we could say probably a lot more about what's taking place than a lot of psychologists. They have their beliefs, but with out-of-body exploration, you're able to go beyond what science can currently measure. You're able to explore in a deeper way. And this is what I find really exciting about all this. There's so much more to talk about. I really am very incredibly limited on time, so I'm going to try and wrap this up the best I can. If you'd like to learn more about this, I have all my business cards on the table over there. That's the only thing on the table, so you'll know you're at the right table. The email address is brand new on that card. I haven't activated it yet, so if you're going to email me, please maybe leave it about a week to give me enough time to do that. Otherwise, look at my name, find me on Facebook, and you can message me straight away if that's what you want to do. So, from my perspective, we're dealing with very real environments, whether we're activating dream states, whether we're entering other realities through the out-of-body state, and they are all physically real. To me, when we talk about non-physical reality, from the perspective of someone in the afterlife on the astral planes, their environments are physically real. Ours seems the one non-physical in nature. If they were to come here to visit us, they would be like a ghost, what we call a ghost, and their hands and everything would go right through objects. They could walk through the walls of our physical environment. That's not real to them. Back on their world, they can't do that. They can't walk through a solid object. We are dealing with an infinite frequency domain, with this space sort of domain overlaying that, with these time domains that are created specifically for these different environments. The Earth plane has its own time domain within the astral planes, occupying the same space, but different time domains. To me, it's very fascinating stuff. I'm going to wrap this up. God, there's so much more I want to say. What can I leave this off with? One of the things I have found through all this journeying is how thought responsive the multiverse is. It responds to prayer. It responds to meditation. We are more powerful than I think we remember. When I do my manifestation practice, I enter a state of meditation with the purpose of leaving behind the everyday drama of my waking life. I do this so I can enter a deep state of spiritual reality, the reality of the true self, beyond the fear mind. To me, enlightenment is not the process of purely learning new stuff. It's also the process of unlearning fear. Because if we truly are interconnected, all minds meet on another level, we already have that knowledge within us. We have wisdom. We have it all. It is just that fear is the barrier that stands between you and the all that is. It's all there. So I use meditation, I use prayer on a regular basis to communicate and interact with these other levels of self. My guides, blue skies from earlier in life, who would appear and reassure me that I'd be okay and that there were people looking after us. The new guides that I have that have reassured me, Todd, take your time in physical reality. Get to really intimately know it. Take a couple hundred lifetimes, it doesn't matter. We're not going anywhere. To us, it's a blink of an eye in our time domain. These different time zones that we experience, sometimes we're in a dream and it seems like hours, and yet we wake up and it was minutes. That's a different time domain, the time domain created on the fly in a dream. And it's very subjective, and so too is this level of reality. But it is very incredibly thought responsive. I have a very fast-paced life in the sense that every single day I've got to a point to where gratitude has become my reflex response when good things happen. When something good happens, I always say, thank you, universe, more please. I was in Manchester just a few days giving a talk, and on arrival, I helped an older gentleman on the bus find the next connecting bus he needed. And afterwards, I thanked the universe because he came to me and I said, thank you, universe, more opportunities to help strangers in strange lands. Within about half an hour, another stranger from another land needed help. And one thing I've learned is if you're going to be this interconnected and you're going to, ask for these kind of things to happen, it's about showing up in your everyday life with the level of presence necessary not to miss the signs, because the signs are evident, they're there always. So for me, the parting message is to use your meditation practice, use your practice of prayer to get firmly grounded in the spiritual reality of your true self, to where you can use that power and that support that is there to bring it back to this level of reality, to remain present here, to do your forgiveness work. All that stuff that we know helps bring down that fear mind, the barrier that stands between us and everybody else around us. That's all I've got time for, I think. Thank you. Thank you.